What's up, guys? So A2L refrigerants are coming in. They're coming in strong. So we have an expert. What he's going to take us through is a presentation. And he starts off with a lot of stuff that builds up to what we need to focus on. Okay, legislation and all that kind of stuff is how we start this podcast off, but it's important to understand how we got to this point. So this is part one. This is Kevin Gill from Master on an A2L presentation that's going to help you guys learn more about A2Ls, tools, precautions, all that kind of stuff. Let's get to it, guys. This is the HVAC Know-It-All podcast. I'm your host, Gary McCready. This podcast is sponsored by Cool Air Products, Master, Cintas, and SupplyHouse.com. Go to the show notes and click on the links to check these guys out. All right, Kevin. So I got a very cool visual. I'll get this out in video form for everybody too, just so they can see this presentation. But if you're riding along in your truck, we'll try to make it as descriptive as possible. So it says right on the front of the screen here, North American A2L transition. Kevin, how you doing, first of all? And let's get to this because there's a lot of people confused. There's a lot of people that want to know more information about A2Ls and how to move forward.
Yeah, Gary. So first and foremost, a privilege to be with you today, and hello to all the listeners out there. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of uncertainty. So today we're going to cover the North American A2L transition. And we have a lot of industry anxiety across North America as a result of it. When we look at the term A2L, there is a lot of that trepidation. There is anxiety that comes with that. But when we look at transition, we've actually been through a considerable amount of them over time. And as a result of that, I think that's where it's going to bring a lot more calm to it. Not to mention the takeaway of this entire presentation is effectively don't panic. Because apart from the fact that we have gone through a multitude and a plethora of transitions over the course of many, many decades, this is just one more that speaks to our environmental stability and sustainability moving forward. But to better understand kind of how we got here, we want to go through an evolution of refrigerants and kind of where it all began. And we'll keep it short and sweet, but ultimately for some folks that are newer to the trade or perhaps a little bit more unfamiliar from historical events, it's very, very important that everybody has a foundational understanding of where we began.
Okay.
And one of the first refrigerants ever used was sulfur dioxide and ether, both of which are very, very volatile refrigerants, very highly flammable, toxic in some cases. And as a result, you really can't use that today, right? But moving forward into 1928, for those of you who can actually see the screen, I'll kind of walk through a very brief timeline for you. In 1928, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Megley, he actually invented chlorofluorocarbon 12, or otherwise known as R12. And he was actually a gentleman that worked at Dayton Research Laboratories and then went on to work for General Motors. And in fact, with his biochemistry brilliance, he was one of the pioneers of leaded gasoline as well. But moving into the 1940s, we started to have a need to develop more sustainable and safe refrigerants, such as that of R502. And when 502 came out, again, in the low-temp marketplace, it was a very predominant refrigerant. Because let's face it, we only had the three majors in the HFC or CFC marketplace, which was R12, R22, and R502. Apart from that of, say, R744 CO2 and R717 ammonia. And ammonia goes back to the 1860s. But in 1970, we started to we paid a lot more of an acute attention to our environment and our sustainability. And we did multiple studies, everything from our global warming conditions to polar ice caps melting and so forth. And as a result, into the 1980s, we developed something called the Montreal Protocol. And for those that are not familiar with the Montreal Protocol, effectively what it is it's a treaty that was signed by 62 countries during its conception. But later, which brings us to present day, there is now 197 signatories. And fun fact about the Montreal Protocol, it's actually the first ever globally ratified treaty in United Nations history. So it's quite remarkable how big of a deal this is when we speak to our climate goals around the world. So in saying that, I digress. The Montreal Protocol covers that of all of our greenhouse emissions. That could be buildings, that could be power plants, that could be our refrigeration business or what have you. But moving forward in time into 1993, that's when we started to see the phase down of CFC or chlorofluorocarbons. So that to the likes of R12 and R502, we started to phase that down.
Mm-hmm.
And that was part of the Kigali Amendment, which we'll cover in a little bit. But it's important to realize that the Montreal Protocol is kind of this big umbrella versus that of the Kigali Agreement or amendment of the Montreal Protocol, which puts a spotlight on our industry. In 1996, that was it. CFCs were completely phased out. And then in 1995, we saw the very first implemented R410A air conditioner. And it's interesting because for those of us in North America who think back, we go, well, hold on a minute. It's very, very interesting that we had a implementation of the very first R410A air conditioner in 1995, but really the transition happened in 2010. And the takeaway from that is just because something is implemented doesn't mean that when it becomes commercially available, that gas wasn't conceived years or even decades beforehand. And then we experienced another transition in 2020, which was the phase out or banning of HCFC, which we would know better as R22. And that not only affected our HVAC side, but also our refrigeration side, because the phase down of our gases and our GWP thresholds started to decline to a point where R22, R404, R507 and other popular gases were no longer permitted. And that brings us to present day, 2024, where we're moving into A2Ls and A3s, all predicated on global warming potential thresholds and global warming potential numbers, which we'll talk a bit more about. But the grand takeaway from this entire slide and this entire timeline is we've been through a number of transitions. This is just another one, and our industry will pivot accordingly. And I'm confident with the talent we've got across North America, we'll do so with a relatively good amount of ease.
Yeah. And I just want to add in there, I know a lot of industry professionals are upset about R22 sort of going away because, I mean, it was a very good refrigerant, easy to work with. You could basically have one refrigerant in your service vehicle for most things. I mean, it was all air conditioning. It was a lot of refrigeration too. So It's a real learning curve and something that techs are going to have to jump out of their comfort zone and get used to because it's no longer mainstream anymore. I mean, it's still available, right? But they're not making it, and it's still available in small quantities around, I guess, North America. But I guess it's time to move on, right, Kevin?
Yeah, it really is. And, I grew up in the industry since I was very, very young. And, my father's a 55-year veteran technician. And, growing up in 1222, 502 for those more seasoned technicians, nobody likes change. We have a natural need to have muscle memory. We want to make sure we stick to what we know, what we love, what we trust, and what we know is tried and proven through the ages. But at the end of the day, when we made that transition, say from 502 or R12 over to 404 and 507, there was a whole new generation that wouldn't want to let them go, which we then saw ourselves letting go of in 2020 as well. So again, the takeaway is, although people don't like to pivot, we absolutely must. And once you get used to it and you start to practice that golf swing and get into the groove of things, you have a lot more confidence moving forward.
Yeah, of course. You have to get your hands dirty with it in order to get that confidence, right?
Absolutely. So, and it's important that we have a good understanding of why all of this is happening, because when we talk about the change of refrigerants, it's really all predicated on one thing, and it's global warming potential. And we throw that term around, and in a lot of cases, it's misunderstood. And for those of whom that aren't familiar, GWP is global warming potential. And what it is it's a measurement of how much energy, okay, and that's a euphemism for heat, okay, so how much heat can the emission of 1 ton of refrigerant absorb over a given period of time, and how does that contrast to that of CO2? So to give you an idea or a good contrast is if we look at, say, 404, it's got a GWP of a little over 3,900 versus that of CO2, which has a GWP of 1, okay, which is a natural refrigerant that our Earth emits, and we are now starting to see become more and more prevalent in our sector of business. But all of our legislations are predicated on the global warming potential numbers, which are in an index, and every single gas is given a rating. And again, it's based upon how much heat that gas can trap when it leaks in the air and how long it keeps that trapped. And then, of course, how long it takes to dissipate over a given period of time.
Okay. That makes sense. Yep.
So in our industry, the three majors, of course, is chlorofluorocarbons, so CFCs, so that of R12 and R502, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, so gases like R22, and then hydrofluorocarbons, which is a broad spectrum, 404, 507, 410 are HFCs. So all of these refrigerants, including a lot of the A2Ls that are forthcoming, are all part of this small family. And in our industry, our gases, be it CFC, HCFC, or HFCs, all carry a considerably higher GWP number. And historically, as we go back in time, those numbers get higher and higher because we weren't focused on environmental sustainability. But today, we do have a very acute focus for a sustainable future and to make sure we mitigate those emissions. And a lot of people say, well, why are we constantly concerned about GWP? We're very responsible. We have good regulators throughout North America. We do responsible reclamation and recycling and disposal of these refrigerants. But again, I remind everybody, this is a global phenomenon, and not every country pays as acute attention as North America does to those climate accords. So the sum total of all of that is the larger the GWP given gas has, the more it warms up the earth over time. And even removing your hose off of a Schrader valve, or even if we had a little bit of leakage, we see our refrigerant desperately needing a lower GWP number as a result of that seeping out into our environment and taking hundreds or even thousands of years to break down.
I know Europe has been very strict on this for many, many years now, right?
They have. And I'm glad you brought that up, because we do actually have a slide that covers global demographics and how far ahead a lot of the countries and continents are. But to put that into perspective, a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of visiting Chilventa, one of the largest refrigeration expositions in Germany. And over there in the refrigeration sector, there is only 3 refrigerants that they're using, and that's propane-based, so refrigerants like R290, CO2 or R744, and that of ammonia, which is R717. And relative to GWP, CO2 has a GWP of 1, and propane-based refrigerants have a GWP of 3, and ammonia has a GWP of 0. So it's quite interesting how far ahead they are, not only in the technology, but also in terms of responsible climate accord.
Interesting.
That brings us to the United States. And the reason why we talk about the U.S. first in these presentations is because the United States has a very solid footing and a good timeline and good criteria already written into legislation, and will very, very shortly, within the next 6 to 8 weeks, go into law in different segments. And every segment is different in terms of a GWP threshold and a timing of enforcement. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But it's very, very important to understand that Canada doesn't have the same footing. And we'll talk a bit more about where we are federally within the confines of Canada. But to better understand how the U.S. writes these laws, we have to understand who writes them first. And it really all hails from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And what they did was they wrote the AIM Act, the American Innovation Manufacturing Act. And on October the 5th last year, the Environmental Protection Agency published what they call a TTR, or Technology Transition Rule. And effectively, that ruling ensures the alignment with the Kigali Amendment. And you heard me mention that earlier. So it is an addition or an appendix to the Montreal Protocol. And effectively what it is it's a spotlight on our industry, and it's responsible for responsible phase down and phase out of particular refrigerants over the course of time. And that's, again, predicated on the GWP threshold. So we'll see, for instance, a phase down in how much refrigerant we can manufacture domestically or import into the country, be it the US, Canada, or otherwise in some other countries. But all the same, that Kigali amendment, it has a much brighter spotlight on our segment of business. And again, it's an amendment to the Montreal Protocol, of which both the United States and Canada are signatories. So beginning on January 1st, the TTR is going to prohibit the manufacturers for the importation of products and the manufacturing of products that contain a specific GWP of refrigerant. Okay. And effectively, as opposed to trying to govern contractors or trying to govern wholesalers or other entities like consultants and engineering firms, they've gone directly to the source. And what they've said is, the equipment that you're going to manufacture, we want to make sure that it operates a component, so a refrigerant, that is in alignment with our environmental protocol. And 3 years, as per the EPA, 3 years after our first enforcement date, which is January 1st of 2025 for a very specific segment, we are going to completely shut it down. We're no longer going to have any equipment that's going to be permitted to operate with certain GWPs, because there is going to be a sell-through period, hence the 3 years. And a sell-through period is very, very important. And I'll contrast it to that of 2010, when we went from R22 to 410. We saw a lot of R22 dry charge units.
Yeah, correct. That's
post the enforcement date.
Yeah.
Right. And that's part of that sell-through period. And not to mention, there is likely going to be some service models available. This will be manufacturer dependent. There may be some amendments to the legislation. But at the end of the day, if we have, say, a condensing unit and an air handler, and for those listening, if you've ever gone into a building and they built the building around the air handler, and there's a good chance of us getting it out, but there's not a good chance of getting a new one in.
Yeah.
That speaks to these sell-through periods being effective, because now we can have a service replacement model because we're not replacing the entire system.
Gotcha. Okay. I've been to a lot of buildings where you're standing in the mechanical room in the penthouse and you're like, if this thing ever needs to be replaced, how are they doing it? Because they craned it in when the building was being built and sat it on a concrete block and closed the building up.
Exactly. And I think there's more of those out there than we think. So, for as much as new legislation is coming in, thankfully, there have been a lot of some very wise people consulted throughout our industry, and some of the finest minds we've got, to make sure that these kinds of things mitigate the pain for the transition that all of our contracting communities need to face.
Gotcha. Cool.
So to better understand kind of where these thresholds are, it's broken down by segments. And I'll reiterate, this is the United States. So for those of you actually watching, there's a chart here, and we start with stationary residential and light commercial air conditioning and heat pumps. So the left-hand column stipulates an industry segment. The next column over gives us a little bit more of a description and or criteria of said segment. So in this case, residential and light commercial air conditioning and heat pump systems, example, mini splits, unitary systems, etc., with a GWP limit threshold of 700. To put that into perspective, 410A carries a GWP of 2,088. So it's considerably more. We've cut this by 2/3. Okay. And on January 1st, that is going to be our very first segment of business that's going to be enforced.
Okay.
Okay. That's our very first date in this particular segment that's going to be enforced. So that is why there is a lot of talk about A2Ls coming into the North American space, simply because we are going to see this happen in just about 6 weeks' time. Some manufacturers have worked much quicker, others not so much. Again, everybody's a little different. However, it's important to realize that in Canada, for your Canadian listeners, a lot of folks say, well, if we don't have solid federal legislation as of yet, which we don't, and we'll talk a bit more about, why does this affect us? Well, if you look at some of the largest names in the manufacturing sector, they're in the United States. And as a result of the enforcement affecting our manufacturers directly in terms of what they can produce, Canada is going to experience the enforcement as if we had written it ourselves.
Okay.
Simply because we get a lot of that equipment and we procure quite a bit out of the United States market.
Mm-hmm. So
right?
With the cold storage warehousing being the lowest, along with retail food supermarkets, is that because they contain the most amount of refrigerant? And if there is a release, we want that GWP the lowest possible? Is that the thinking there?
That is the thinking. And in fact, they've gone a step further, and it speaks to your point. For cold storage warehouses or 3PL logistics, even when you start getting into some food processing facilities and so forth, they put certain criteria, such as if you have a system, or I should say a circuit, because a circuit would be a system in itself, exceeding 200 pounds, you will need to have a refrigerant of 150 GWP or less.
All right.
If you have a system or a circuit with less than 200 pounds, you're able to go up to 300 GWP. But to put that into perspective, that eliminates well over 90% of every gas you've ever heard of, we've ever known, loved, or trusted.
Interesting.
And then we look at retail food supermarkets. Again, north of 200 pounds, 150, less than 200 pounds, 300. And the only contrast between them is the enforcement date. So the cold storage warehouses and standard commercial refrigeration, we're looking at January 1st of 2026, giving the industry a little bit more room to pivot, a little bit longer of a time. And then, of course, the supermarket world, even more time is required because there's a plethora of them and a lot more common than that of the cold storage warehouses. And that enforcement date is January 1st of 2027. Okay. But it's important to realize, again, moving back to Canada for just a moment, that a lot of our major equipment manufacturers are right here in Canada. So as a result of us having no federal legislation and being able to produce a considerable amount of our refrigeration products domestically, we won't feel the pinch in the refrigeration sector quite yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So just when we thought the fun was over, we'll move over to chillers, because this is something that we, I won't say often forget, but let's face it, one of the major focuses is on the unitary market space in contrast to that of chillers. So if we look at the comfort cooling chillers, for example, it too has an enforcement date of January 1st, 2025. And some of the more predominant refrigerants in the comfort cooling space were things like R410, R134, which we are now seeing move over to that of R32 or R454B. If you were running something on the process side and you were using 134, you can no longer use that gas because 134 has a GWP of higher than about 1400, I believe. And as a result, we now see ourselves with R513 or R450, very close cousin to that of 134. Thankfully, they're A1 refrigerant, but we are seeing in the comfort cooling space, especially R32 and 454B, which are our two big A2Ls coming into the North American space. They're already taking hold. We've seen one or two chillers already land with that refrigerant in it, and many more in the bid and spec and quoting and estimation stages with the new refrigerant.
Cool. It's a lot of information here, man. I'm glad you've put this all into a very organized presentation, because I think it's a lot easier to follow when it's done this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, that brings us to Canada, because for as organized as the United States is, and that's not to say Canada isn't, but we don't have good, solid federal legislative footing. Okay, that's the best way I can put it. But before we start talking about where Canada is, no different and not dissimilar to the US, we have to understand who in Canada is responsible for our legislation. And not dissimilar to that of the EPA, ours is the ECCC, Environment Climate Change Canada. And much like the AIM Act, the American Innovation Manufacturing Act, we wrote ODSHAR, the Canadian Ozone Depleting Substances and Halocarbon Alternative Regulations. A little bit of a mouthful, but again, exactly the same as the AIM Act, because it is responsible for keeping pace with our climate accords and in keeping in alignment with the Montreal Protocol and the Kigali Amendment and so forth. But something very interesting happened a little earlier this year in August. So on August the 9th, HRAI had sent a draft copy called a consultation document to Environment Climate Change Canada for review. And HRAI is a very, very good conduit between industry and that of government officials. They're very, very heavily involved, and I applaud them for all that they do, because effectively what the industry needs to do is not only align with our climate accords, but again, mitigate how much pivoting we need to make and ensure our manufacturers, our contractors, our wholesalers, and our consulting firms and engineering firms are all ready to make this change.
Mm-hmm.
So thankfully, that's where folks like HRAI and ORAC and a number of other associations become very valuable because they give the industry a voice. And on the 9th, we submitted that consultation document to show what we propose in terms of aligning with our climate accords. Now, the chart isn't as descriptive as that of the United States, but it's descriptive enough. So starting with the comfort cooling, the Canadian legislators are digesting this and they're working on it. And I'm confident not too long from now, we'll likely have an updated version of this. But on January 1st, 2026, that's when they're proposing that we will have ratified legislation on the subject, right? Same thing for chillers, 2025, 700 GWP limit once again, and that goes back to the R513s, the 450s, the R454Bs, the R32s, and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about condensing units, then this is where a little bit of clarity is needed. Well, when we say condensing units, what industry segment are we talking about? Let's get some clarity and some definitions around that, okay? But it, too, will be limited to 700 GWP, once again, pushing us in the direction of A2L refrigerants. There is some clarity, however, on things like mobile refrigeration, so the reefer truck, our passenger vehicles, which were already enacted back in 2021. For anybody who has a car that's post-2021, from a manufacturing date, you'll notice it's no longer 134, it's R1234. So those types of things we have clarity on. Again, medium-duty passenger vehicles, agricultural tractors, and so forth, we are seeing some clarity. But at the moment, this is in proposal stage.
Okay. Gotcha.
Now, if there's one thing that's unclear, and I've talked to a number of industry experts about this, there is an industry segment on this that we feel is missing. And if it's not missing, then certainly some more refined descriptions around it. It's refrigeration. And I think it's important to realize where we are in the refrigeration sector present day when it comes to our legislation. And the way we've written the law federally, save that of Quebec, which I'll talk about in just a moment, for rack systems, large condensing units, we're looking at something less than 2,200 GWP. Versus that of standalone units, we're looking at 1,400 GWP. That's our current active legislation. And that was enacted by ODSHAR in 2020, the same time that we phased out R22 and HCFCs. And as a result of both of those thresholds for those two different industry segments, that being of large racks and centralized systems, and the standalones for, ma and pa's flower shop and other walk-in coolers and freezers at 1,400 GWP, that's where 448 and 449 took predominance because they fall below both of those thresholds, right? In Quebec, they were a little bit more progressive. In 2021, Quebec provincially enacted a law that said if you are less than 50 kilowatt, you have to be under 1,500 GWP. So thankfully, 448, 449 can still do the job. However, if you are greater than 50 kilowatt And for those of you working in the imperial system, 50 kilowatt is give or take about 15, 16 net tons, right? If you're greater than 50 kilowatt, you need to be under 150 GWP. And as we progressively move down that scale to a lesser GWP, we become more and more unfamiliar with the refrigerants that are able to do that job and meet those thresholds. So things like 455A, 454C, 454A, 516, these are going to be the gases of the future. And it's all predicated not only on some progressive provinces like Quebec and what will certainly be forthcoming federally across Canada, but already implemented in the United States with forthcoming enforcement dates.